Do Bible scholars just make stuff up? This is something that people have hurled around in my comments a little bit the last couple of weeks, and I thought I would take a stab at answering it because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what biblical scholars actually do. But before we get to that, okay, my name is Chris. I have a Master of Divinity, Master of Arts in Theology, and a PhD in Christian Origins, and I talk about early Christianity and a little bit about modern Christianity, so take a second and subscribe if you haven't done so. So let me tell you about where this came from. It all started when I did this video talking about how Josephus could have been a source for Acts. And I laid out pretty clearly the evidence, the argument for, the argument against, and pretty clearly said we don't actually know. That's where I ended the video, is literally saying we don't know. And I had some people respond by saying things like, the amount of speculation in this field is wild, or Bible scholars just make stuff up. And it's given me some pause to think about my field and maybe to be a little bit humble about what we're doing as biblical scholars. But I think there's a problem. And I think the first fundamental problem as a biblical scholar is that you are working with limited evidence. But most people get their information about the Bible from people with the same limited evidence who have construed that evidence into a story that they believe and try to present it as rock solid certainty. So I just finished, as I'm recording this, I haven't put it public yet, but I just finished recording a video basically talking about how little we actually know about where the Gospels came from. And we don't think they're eyewitnesses because when we look at the earliest traditions, people are copying sayings of Jesus. In some cases, they look a little bit like our Gospel sayings. In some cases, they don't. We see the church fathers using different material. We see different stories. And until like the end of the 2nd century, we don't have any idea where the Gospels came from. They're just like, they're out there. The evidence is patchy. But one thing that is really, really clear is that the story that I was often told growing up, that the Gospels were eyewitnesses that came from four streams that all connected to apostles in different ways, that's where the Gospels came from, and we can be sure of that. And I am very confident saying, as a biblical scholar, that those stories are nonsense. Those stories came from centuries later. Those stories don't actually fit the evidence we have. We have very, very tiny little fragmentary things, like, for example, Papias saying that the Gospel of Mark was Peter's recollections around AD 120, somewhere in the early 1st century. So fine, like, there are early glimpses of gospel traditions. Papias doesn't know about any other gospels as far as we can tell. He mentions any of our 4 gospels. He mentions the Gospel of Matthew, but he says the Gospel of Matthew is written in Hebrew and it's logia, or sayings of Jesus, which is not what our Gospel of Matthew is. Papias also mentions the Gospel to the Hebrews. We get all this through Eusebius. So what happens when you're a Bible scholar and you are stepping out to try to educate people in a world where people are fundamentally misinformed, that people have spent a lifetime being misinformed, sometimes unintentionally, often unintentionally. Often pastors just don't know. Often priests just don't know. They're saying things that they have heard, people have told them, and it sounds good and we say it. So we say things like the Gospels are eyewitnesses. But when you actually go and look at the evidence, you see how quickly that starts to fall apart. So then what do you do? Well, if you're a biblical scholar, you train for a lifetime and you look at that and you recognize we have very little evidence about where the Gospels actually came from. But if I've done the training and I've looked at the evidence we do have, I can start to put together a picture of what might have happened. A hypothesis, as it were, but based very, very clearly on the evidence that we do have. And that's a lot of what biblical scholarship does, frankly. And a lot of people look at that and say, you're just making stuff up. You're just hypothesizing. But what they're doing is they're holding the work of biblical scholars, like the actual work biblical scholars do, up against the assumptions and legends and laziness, frankly, of many Christian apologists or people who have told them things about the Gospels or about the Bible. And they're holding those two things in tandem. And one of those groups seems really, really certain. One of those groups seems to have a really clear answer about where the Bible came from. We can trust all these things, eyewitness accounts to the empty tomb of Jesus. We have all these like accurate recollections of the stories of Jesus. We know that all of the letters of Paul are all actually from Paul, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You get one group that's really, really certain. And one group, biblical scholars who know what the hell they're talking about, who have some intellectual humility to say, we don't really know, but here's what could have happened. And that's where you get the problem, in my experience. That's where you get the problem, is that you start to say, here's what could have happened. And people are like, well, why are you so uncertain? How come this field just gets to make stuff up? And it's like, we're not making stuff up. We're working with the evidence we have to try to create an explanation. And that's literally what historians do. And let's think about this, because this, I think, is important to understand. The world of studying the New Testament in the 20th century, think about this, okay? From the turn of the 1900s, we have had the Oxyrhynchus papyri and other significant papyrological finds in Egypt that have exploded our understanding of early Christian literature and the world of early Christians. We had the Nag Hammadi library that gave us new gospels from early Christianity. Some of them are Coptic, some of them Gnostic, quote unquote, came later. But still, it exploded the world of what we know about early Christianity. We also, in the 1940s, around the same time as Nag Hammadi, had the Dead Sea Scrolls. So all of a sudden, we've got all of these Jewish, like Hebrew manuscripts we can line up and compare, and it gives us an idea about where the early Jesus movement could have come from or what might have influenced it or whatever. And we have an explosion of archaeological work by universities around the world. We have new inscriptions and new papyri, not just from early Christian groups, but from similar groups and from all sorts of kind of analogous groups that help us understand what was happening in early Christianity. So you take all of this evidence and add to that data science. Now we can use data science. It's just coming on board, but we're going to be using AI for biblical studies. Like, we're going to be using all of this stuff as historians. These are all the tools that we have in our toolbox, and we are going to have new, theories. We're going to have new ideas about where things came from. And I think it's one of the most exciting times to be a biblical scholar. Like, honestly, I'm not active in the field right now. I do YouTube for fun, but I get to see the work of cool biblical scholars and to share it with you. And I think this is like an incredibly interesting time to be a biblical scholar. I would argue that there has been more change in the last 100 years in biblical scholarship than in the previous 1900 years. And it hasn't come because of a new wave of academics who like to make stuff up. It has not come because of, the liberal academy that just wants to poke at Christianity. It has, in some ways, been a time when we can ask more interesting questions, as orthodoxy has kind of retreated a little bit, and as institutions, both Christian and secular, can ask more difficult, interesting questions about the spread of early Christianity. But this fundamentally is a really exciting time to be in biblical scholarship. And when I share things on my YouTube channel, I do the best I can as somebody trained as a biblical scholar to be responsible with the evidence, to present things. You watch how many times I say in my videos, that could be this, we think this, the evidence suggests this, and how infrequently you will actually hear me say something like, this is what happened 100% of the time. And that's not because I'm making stuff up. It's because I'm trying to be responsible with sources. So this is just the way biblical studies works. It's not a perfect discipline. No discipline is perfect. Every discipline has its own idiosyncrasies. Go look at scientific studies and you will see similar questions and similar assumptions and operating principles of any field. This is the way biblical studies works. It's an amazing field. It's an incredible place to be. And I'm going to try to show it to you on this channel. It's not perfect. It is as good as it can be. And we have the evidence we have to ask really interesting questions. And I'm going to ask a lot of interesting questions. And these are not questions, for the most part, what I'm doing on my channel is not questions that are like far out, wacky theories. A lot of this is just basic scholarship that people in theology departments and religious studies departments know about, but people in the pews don't always know about. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep doing it because I love it. I hope that makes sense to you. This is how the discipline works. Biblical scholars don't just make stuff up, but we do have a world where we get to ask incredible questions. The evidence is more than ever before. We have more to work with than ever before, and it's going to be a really exciting couple decades in biblical scholarship.